All right, let's go. Number 10. Omar Bradley, the general who hid catastrophe behind decency. In the autumn of 1944, General Omar Bradley approved an assault into the Hürtgen Forest, a dense, fortified stretch of woodland straddling the German border, despite intelligence warnings that conditions would be catastrophic. What followed was one of the longest and most brutal engagements in American military history, a battle that consumed division after division for months, without producing any strategic result that could not have been achieved by simply going around it. Bradley had built his public reputation carefully. Known as the soldier's general, he cultivated an image of humility and common decency that made him the deliberate contrast to Patton's theatrics. Soldiers trusted him. Journalists celebrated him. He commanded the 12th Army Group, the largest American ground force ever assembled, 1.3 million men, and he was considered the steady, reliable hand at its center. That image makes the Hürtgen numbers difficult to absorb. Approximately 33,000 American casualties were sustained in that forest over 5 months, fighting for ground that military historian Carlo d'Este later argued should never have been contested at all. The forest neutralized American advantages in armor and air power, fed infantry into a killing ground designed by German defenders, and achieved nothing that altered the course of the campaign. Bradley wrote about his strategic decisions candidly in his 1951 memoir, A Soldier's Story, but candor after the fact does not change what happened in those trees. The German lines held. The American dead accumulated. The forest took them quietly, one unit at a time, while the general who sent them there was celebrated for caring about his men. The most unsettling commanders are not always the volatile ones. Sometimes the most dangerous quality a general can possess is a reputation for decency that makes his worst decisions almost impossible to question. Number 9. James Gavin, the general who led from where men died. On the night of July 9th, 1943, a 36-year-old brigadier general stood at the open door of a C-47 transport aircraft and jumped into the darkness over Sicily. His name was James Gavin. He was leading the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment into combat from the front, not from a command post, not from a map table miles behind the line, but from the aircraft door, with a rifle, into the same darkness his men were falling into. No general was supposed to do this. The Army's logic was straightforward. Officers who command thousands of men are too valuable to be killed or captured in the opening minutes of an airborne assault. Generals direct. They do not jump. Gavin disagreed with this logic completely, and he spent the entire war proving it wrong in ways that simultaneously inspired his men and alarmed his superiors. Gavin made 4 combat jumps during World War II, Sicily, Italy, Normandy, and Operation Market Garden in Holland. He became the youngest 2-star general in U.S. Army history at 37 in 1944, commanding the 82nd Airborne Division in some of the war's most ferocious fighting. He raised concerns about Market Garden's planning to superior officers before it launched. He was overruled. The operation resulted in approximately 17,000 Allied casualties. The specific danger Gavin represented to his own command structure was structural, not personal. A general leading from the front can be killed, eliminating the officer responsible for thousands of men. He can be captured, handing the enemy intelligence of incalculable value. And he can make tactical decisions on the spot that override strategic ones, because in the chaos of a drop zone, he is the senior officer present, and no one can stop him. Gavin's fearlessness was never in question. What kept his superiors awake was something more difficult to manage. The unspoken argument his presence on a drop zone made every single time, that if you were not willing to die alongside your men, you had no legitimate right to order them to. Number 8. Joseph Stilwell, the general who treated allies like enemies. In October 1944, President Franklin Roosevelt received a direct ultimatum from Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of nationalist China and one of America's most critical Pacific allies. Remove General Joseph Stilwell from his command immediately, or the alliance would collapse. Roosevelt complied within days. It was a humiliation for the United States Army, and it was entirely predictable to anyone who had watched Stilwell operate for the previous 2 years. Stilwell had commanded U.S. forces in the China-Burma-India theater since 1942, and from the beginning he had treated the requirement to maintain functional relationships with allies as an inconvenience. He referred to Chiang Kai-shek in his private diaries, later published as Peanut. He described British commanders in official communications using language that would end a career in any modern organization. He was relentless in his contempt, uncompromising in his opinions, and utterly incapable of the diplomatic patience the theater required. What complicates the picture is that Stilwell was frequently correct. His assessment of Chiang's military leadership was accurate. His frustration with British strategic priorities in the theater was shared by American planners in Washington. He led the 1942 retreat from Burma on foot, 140 miles through jungle, and called it publicly a hell of a beating, refusing to dress the disaster up as anything other than what it was. His 1944 Myitkyina campaign in northern Burma was a genuine strategic achievement, but none of that mattered by October 1944, because Stilwell's personality had become the crisis. His continued presence in the theater was threatening to destroy the alliance he was fighting to support. Barbara Tuchman's Pulitzer Prize-winning 1971 biography, Stilwell and the American Experience in China, documents a man of formidable ability, whose character made him almost impossible to deploy without collateral damage. When a general is so ferocious in his contempt for everyone around him that his presence costs more than his absence, the enemy he poses to his own side's objectives becomes indistinguishable from the one he's supposed to be fighting. Number 7. Mark Clark, the general, whose ambition prolonged the war. On June 4, 1944, 2 days before D-Day, General Mark Clark made a decision that military historians have argued about ever since. With German forces in full retreat from Rome and Allied units positioned to encircle the withdrawing German 10th Army, Clark ordered his commanders to abandon the encirclement and pivot toward Rome instead. He wanted his forces, not the British, to be the first into the Eternal City. The German 10th Army escaped. The Italian campaign continued for months. Clark had been one of the Army's fastest rising officers. He became the youngest lieutenant general in American military history when he was promoted in November 1942 at age 46, and his early career justified the acceleration. He was intelligent, energetic, and tactically capable, a general who genuinely understood the mechanics of large-scale operations. His rapid rise also produced something more troubling, a consuming preoccupation with his own place in history. The Italian campaign under Clark's command had already extracted an enormous price before the Rome decision. The Battle of Monte Cassino ran from January to May 1944, producing tens of thousands of Allied casualties across 4 grinding battles. The destruction of the Monte Cassino monastery on February 15, 1944, ordered under Clark's theater command, obliterated one of Europe's most significant historical sites. The military justification for that decision remains contested to this day. British General Harold Alexander expressed fury at the Rome decision in communications that were later declassified. He understood, as Clark must have understood, that allowing the German 10th Army to escape meant more fighting, more casualties, and a longer campaign. Clark understood this. He chose Rome anyway. His photograph appeared on the front page of newspapers around the world on June 5, 1944. The men who died in the months that followed because the German 10th Army was not destroyed at Valmontone do not appear in those photographs. That is the arithmetic of vanity at the command level, and it is not an abstraction. Number 6. William Halsey, the admiral who almost lost the Pacific War twice. On the night of October 25, 1944, the Japanese Navy executed a diversionary maneuver so precisely calculated that it lured Admiral William "Bull" Halsey and his entire Third Fleet north, away from the invasion force it was supposed to be protecting. Halsey took all 6 of his fleet carriers, chasing what he believed was the main Japanese force. He left the Lady Gulf landing operation protected by nothing but escort carriers and destroyers. The resulting battle came within hours of being a catastrophic American defeat. Halsey's reputation had been built on audacity. After Pearl Harbor, when the Pacific Fleet was shattered and American morale had collapsed, Halsey's aggressive early raids on Japanese-held islands gave the country something to hold on to. He was bold where boldness was needed, relentless in attack, and beloved by his sailors. His instinct was always forward, always offensive, and in the early years of the Pacific War, that instinct served the United States well. At Lady Gulf, it nearly destroyed everything. The message sent by Admiral Nimitz asking for the location of Task Force 34, containing the added phrase, "The world wonders," in a communications padding error, became one of the most famous and humiliating signals in U.S. naval history. Halsey received it as an accusation. He was not wrong to read it that way. He had chased a decoy fleet while the invasion force was being attacked by Japanese battleships. Then, he did it again. In December 1944, Halsey sailed his fleet into Typhoon Cobra despite weather warnings. 3 destroyers sank. Approximately 790 sailors drowned. A subsequent Navy Court of Inquiry found errors in judgment on Halsey's part. He was shielded from formal charges by Admiral Nimitz and Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal. In June 1945, he sailed into a second typhoon under similar circumstances. There is a version of Halsey's story where boldness wins the Pacific War. There is another version, equally true, where the same boldness twice brought catastrophe within reach of everything the United States had built in that ocean. Number 5. Dwight Eisenhower, the general whose caution may have cost thousands of lives. In September 1944, with Germany reeling from the D-Day invasion and Allied forces advancing at a speed that had surprised everyone, General Dwight Eisenhower made the strategic decision that defined the final year of the war in Europe. Rather than concentrating his forces for a single thrust deep into Germany, as Montgomery proposed from the north and Patton was effectively executing from the south, Eisenhower chose a broad front advance across the entire Allied line. He believed it was the safer, more manageable approach. His subordinates believed he was handing Germany time it desperately needed. Eisenhower had been selected as Supreme Allied Commander of the European Theater of Operations, not because he was the most brilliant battlefield tactician, but because he was the most capable coalition manager the United States Army possessed. He could hold Montgomery and Patton and the competing demands of the British and American governments in something approaching alignment, which was itself a form of military genius. Field Marshal Alan Brooke, Churchill's chief military advisor, wrote in his published diaries that Eisenhower has a limited brain from a strategic point of view. The British were often condescending about American generals. In this case, the criticism had some specific justification. The Battle of the Bulge, launched by Germany in December 1944, killed or wounded approximately 75,000 American soldiers in 6 weeks, the largest single-battle American loss of the entire war. Many historians argue that Germany's capacity to mount that offensive was a direct consequence of the broad front strategy, allowing German forces time to regroup and resupply. Eisenhower's defenders argue the broad front was logistically necessary. The argument has never been cleanly resolved. Before D-Day, Eisenhower wrote a short message accepting full personal responsibility for failure, to be released if the invasion collapsed. It was found in his papers after the war, never sent. He understood the weight of decisions made at his level better than almost anyone alive. He kept that note in his pocket on June 6, 1944, which tells you everything you need to know about what kind of man he was. Whether his strategic choices after that day cost lives that a bolder approach would have saved is a question the veterans of the Bulge carried with them for the rest of theirs. Number 4. George Marshall, the general who built the machine that killed millions. When George Marshall was sworn in as U.S. Army Chief of Staff on September 1, 1939, the same day Germany invaded Poland, The American army ranked 17th in the world in size, smaller than Portugal's. The officers who served under him during the years that followed described a man of such absolute, unyielding authority that even the most senior generals were careful about how they entered his office. Not because he was cruel, because he was completely certain, and because careers ended in his presence with a single quiet sentence. Marshall's particular form of danger was institutional. He never commanded troops in combat during World War II. Roosevelt refused to release him, considering him too valuable to the overall war effort to risk in a field command. Instead, Marshall ran everything from Washington, building an army of 8 million men from a force of 189,000 in less than 4 years, selecting the generals who would command it, overseeing the global strategy that would determine where and how they fought, and managing the political relationships with Churchill, Roosevelt, and the Allied High Command that held the entire enterprise together. He deliberately refused to use President Roosevelt's first name in any context, a calculated decision to prevent any appearance of personal familiarity influencing professional judgment. Officers who failed in his estimation were removed without warning, without appeal, and without explanation. He personally elevated Eisenhower, Bradley, and Patton over hundreds of more senior officers, bypassing standard Army promotion protocols because he had decided they were the right men. Winston Churchill called him the organizer of victory, the only American general Churchill described in those terms. Marshall also sat on the Oversight Committee for the Manhattan Project from its early stages, meaning the most powerful conventional military commander in the war was simultaneously aware of the weapon that would make conventional military power temporarily obsolete. Winston Churchill's phrase was accurate, if incomplete. Marshall did not merely organize victory. He designed the conditions under which it became possible, selected the men who would execute it, and removed without sentiment anyone who could not meet the standard he had set. The machine he built killed millions of people, on the right side and the wrong one, and he built it with the cold, complete precision of a man who understood exactly what he was constructing. Number 3, Curtis LeMay, the general who burned a nation to the ground. On the night of March 9, 1945, General Curtis LeMay sent 334 B-29 Superfortress bombers over Tokyo, loaded with incendiary bombs. The resulting firestorm killed between 80,000 and 100,000 civilians in a single night, destroying 16 square miles of the city in hours. It was the single most destructive conventional bombing raid in the history of aerial warfare. LeMay assessed the results, judged the approach sound, and ordered it repeated against 67 Japanese cities across the following months. LeMay had redesigned the entire B-29 raid strategy himself, against the strong objections of his crews. He stripped the bombers of their defensive guns to increase bomb load, dropped the operational altitude from 25,000 feet to between 5,000 and 9,000 feet, and switched from daylight precision bombing to low-altitude night incendiary attacks. The crews told him this was suicide. He told them to fly the mission. He was right about the military results. The crews who survived did not always find that comforting. The total civilian death toll from LeMay's conventional bombing campaign across Japan, before the atomic bombs were dropped, is estimated between 300,000 and 500,000 people, a figure that varies significantly depending on methodology and source, but that sits within no range that makes it manageable to contemplate. LeMay himself, speaking publicly after the war, acknowledged the full weight of what he had done. He said directly that if the United States had lost the war, he would have been prosecuted as a war criminal. He said this without apparent regret or qualification. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, LeMay sat in the XCOM meetings as Air Force Chief of Staff and urged President Kennedy to launch immediate airstrikes on Cuba. He called Kennedy's decision to implement a naval blockade instead almost as bad as the appeasement at Munich. The recordings of those meetings confirm the characterization. The man who had burned Japan was, 17 years later, prepared to risk nuclear war over a comparable demonstration of restraint. LeMay understood exactly what he was doing in 1945, which is what separates him from most men who cause destruction on that scale. He had done the mathematics. He had weighed Japanese civilian lives against American soldiers who would die in a land invasion, and he had chosen. Whether that calculation was correct is a question that belongs to history. What is not in question is the scale at which he was willing to make it, and the absolute absence of doubt with which he made it. Number 2. Douglas MacArthur, the general who believed he was above command. On April 11, 1951, President Harry Truman fired General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in the Pacific, Commander of United Nations Forces in Korea, the most decorated American soldier of the 20th century, and the man who had ruled Japan as military governor for 5 years. MacArthur had publicly contradicted American foreign policy, sent an unauthorized ultimatum to Chinese military commanders, and corresponded directly with Republican House Minority Leader Joseph Martin in ways that explicitly undermined the president's stated war aims. Truman called it the hardest decision of his presidency. MacArthur came home to a ticker tape parade. MacArthur's military record contained genuine brilliance alongside decisions of catastrophic consequence, and the two were inseparable in a way that made him almost impossible to evaluate cleanly. His island-hopping strategy in the Pacific saved hundreds of thousands of American lives by bypassing heavily fortified Japanese positions rather than assaulting them directly. His Incheon landing in September 1950, a massive amphibious assault against a port that military planners had called impossible to take, was an act of tactical audacity that changed the entire trajectory of the Korean War. Then he advanced toward the Chinese border against explicit warnings from Washington and against intelligence assessments that predicted Chinese intervention at exactly the threshold he was approaching. China entered the war in November 1950 with approximately 300,000 troops. The Korean War, which had seemed close to resolution, continued for 3 more years. Approximately 36,570 false Americans died in that conflict. MacArthur's advance to the Yalu River is directly implicated in the circumstances that produced most of those deaths. His earlier record contains its own shadows. When the Philippines fell in 1942 and MacArthur was ordered to evacuate to Australia, he went. The men he left behind at Bataan and Corregidor endured the Bataan Death March, in which estimates of Filipino and American prisoner deaths range from 10,000 to 18,000. MacArthur was awarded the Medal of Honor for the Philippines campaign, an award that critics, including some of his contemporaries, argued was based substantially on his own after-action reports. He received it without apparent discomfort. MacArthur challenged civilian control of the military more directly and more publicly than any American general before or since, and the country gave him a parade. That is the most unresolved thing about him, and it has nothing to do with tactics. Number 1. George Patton, the weapon no one could fully control. On August 3, 1943, General George Patton walked into a military field hospital in Sicily and approached a soldier who had been admitted for combat stress reaction, what the Army then called shell shock, and what we now understand as a serious psychological consequence of sustained combat. Patton slapped him across the face. He called him a coward. 7 days later, at a different hospital, he did it again to a second soldier, this time drawing his pistol and pressing it against the man's head before being physically restrained by medical staff. The incidents nearly ended his career. They did not. And that decision, Eisenhower's decision, to protect and retain him, shaped the final 2 years of the war in Europe more profoundly than almost any other choice made by Allied command. Patton had been the most feared American general in the European theater long before Sicily. The Germans tracked his assignments obsessively. Their intelligence services rated him the most dangerous Allied commander they faced, more dangerous than Eisenhower, more dangerous than Montgomery, more dangerous than Bradley. After the slapping incidents became public in November 1943, Eisenhower kept Patton sidelined, but he did not discard him. Instead, he used him as a decoy. Operation Fortitude, the Allied deception campaign designed to convince Germany that the main D-Day invasion would land at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy, centered on making the Germans believe Patton would command the assault. They believed it completely. Many historians credit Fortitude, and by extension Patton's fearsome reputation, as a critical factor in D-Day's success. He was so dangerous that his mere existence, doing nothing, deceived an entire army. When Patton's Third Army was finally activated in France in August 1944, it advanced approximately 600 miles in under 3 months, a rate of movement at that scale that had no precedent in the history of warfare. His supply lines could not keep pace. His flanks were perpetually exposed. He requested halts to air support on multiple occasions because his lines were moving faster than aircraft could be briefed on friendly positions. He outran the ability of the Allied command structure to track him, which was simultaneously his greatest tactical asset and a source of genuine alarm to the generals responsible for the overall campaign. During the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, when Germany's surprise offensive threatened to split the Allied line, Patton turned an entire army of 250,000 men 90 degrees north and attacked within 48 hours of receiving orders. Omar Bradley, not a man given to extravagant praise, called it the most brilliant logistical achievement in the history of the American Army. By the end of the war in Europe, his Third Army had suffered approximately 160,000 casualties and had inflicted an estimated 1.8 million German casualties, killed, wounded, and captured. After Germany surrendered, Patton began making public statements calling for the rearmament of Germany and suggesting the use of former Nazi officers to fight the Soviet Union. He was removed from command of the Third Army in October 1945. He died on December 21st, 1945, from injuries sustained in a minor automobile accident near Mannheim, Germany, 12 days after the collision, having survived 4 years of combat without a serious wound. What placed Patton at the top of this list is not any single incident. Not the slap, not the Sicily campaign, not the advance through France, not the post-war speeches. It is the totality of what he represented to the people responsible for managing him. The Allied High Command needed him so completely that they could not remove him, feared him so genuinely that they could not fully trust him, and spent the entire war threading that needle while the Germans spent the entire war trying to determine where he would strike next. He was the weapon that no one on either side could fully control. And when the war was over and the weapon was no longer needed, when the man who had been the most lethal instrument the Allied cause possessed was removed from command and left without a purpose, it was a slow-moving staff car on a peaceful German road that finally stopped him. After everything he had survived, the thing that killed George Patton was the ordinary world reasserting itself, and somehow that is the most fitting ending his story could have had. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.